has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, may the peace and blessings of Almighty God be with you. Welcome to this, the 7th episode of Press Point. Today, we're looking at the issue of the Boston bombings and the great tragedy which has come from this. We're asking 3 questions. Firstly, what are the causes of this tragedy? Secondly, how has it impacted upon Americans and upon everybody across the world? And then finally, we're looking at solutions. What can we do to prevent future attacks and tragedies of this nature and to ensure that true Islam is shown to the world? I'm lucky and blessed to be joined by my good friend and brother Farooq Mahmood in the studio.
Thank you very much. Yes, of course, looking at Boston bombings, causes, effect and solutions. Please do write to us, send us your emails at presspoint@mt.tv, send us tweets at presspointmt. Do use the hashtag presspointmta. Also, our Presspoint team will be sending out tweets regularly to update you wherever you are as to what is being discussed in the studio and our Skype guest. So if you can't watch the show live, please by all means follow us on the Twitter.
Excellent. Now in the studio, we have 2 familiar faces to Presspoint. Alhamdulillah, this is your second time joining us. Thank you very much. On my immediate left, I have Fareed Ahmed, who's of course from the External Affairs Desk within the UK. Assalamu alaikum, Fareed.
Wa alaikum salam.
And we also have Khalil Yusuf, who is from the International Press Desk for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community. Assalamu alaikum, Fareed. Pardon me, Khalil. Jazakallah. Okay, so Farooq, I think that you've been very, very intensely researching this topic and you've got some great blogs and tweets for us. What do we start off with?
Start with the story first, which is on BBC. Boston bombings, Obama condemns act of terrorism. That is not exciting, but what is really interesting here is this. Mark Mardell, one of the BBC's editors for North America, he says the mood in America after the Boston bombings generally seems one of sadness and horror, but not one of anger or ramped up patriotism, as that was seen after 9/11. So I think it's a very balanced and a very sensible kind of a message going out that we saw after 9/11. People were jumping the gun and also pointing fingers at different directions. In this case, certainly seems like the American response is far more sensible and more subdued. And certainly there is sadness and horror, but of course not anger of the kind we've seen before. Let's have a look at what the world leaders have been saying about this, shall we?
Yes.
Reminder that so many Americans serve and sacrifice on our behalf every single day without regard to their own safety in dangerous and difficult circumstances. And we salute all those who assisted in responding so quickly and professionally to this tragedy.
I'm deeply shocked by the explosions at the Boston Marathon. Our deep sympathy is with the American people in this hour of sadness and with the families of those who were tragically killed.
What happened in Boston was horrific, and our thoughts are with the families of the victims and, of course, the victims themselves.
Australia unreservedly condemns this brutal and senseless attack on what is a great event known around the world and one people participate in to have fun as their families and friends watch on.
I think that it's quite clear that this is shaking the world. It's been a news story which people have followed all around the world. They've watched it live as the second brother was captured. And it's quite clearly, it's really tugged on the heartstrings in many ways, the tragedy of the event. But what's also useful is to take a sense of what's the response been within Washington, D.C. and within Congress. Now, we know there's only been 2 Muslim congressmen in US history. The second, of course, is Andre Carson of Indiana. We were very blessed to be able to talk to him before the show, get an interview, and get his sense of what were the causes behind this attack, behind the Boston bombings. So let's go and have a listen now, inshallah.
We're now joined by Congressman Andre Carson, who's the second Muslim to be elected to the US Congress. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Carson.
It is an honor to be here. Thank you.
Let me just ask this question. The whole world was horrified by the despicable and malicious bombings in Boston last month. Do you think there is something inherent in the teachings of Islam that leads to violence and terrorism?
Absolutely not. Islam represents peace. Islam, I think, epitomizes what we know as the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is really a common thread that all religious systems share, at least the major ones. What happened in Boston was a devastating and terrible tragedy. It was an attack not just on the city, but on the American way of life. And we need to be clear, though, that these men did not commit these crimes because they're Muslim. They did this because they are twisted and sick extremists. In fact, the oldest boy was kicked out of the mosque because of his message of hate and anger. In truth, they hid their plan from the Muslim community and, as far as we know, from their families. So the question for me is why? And I think the answer is quite succinct. It's because they knew that Muslims would absolutely reject this kind of hatred and bigotry.
Do you think there is some clash of civilizations here?
I don't think it is a clash of civilizations as much as it is a clash of ideology, cultural mythologies, even racial mythologies that have become more pervasive and exacerbated, largely due to the lack of engagement between government, the law enforcement community, and the greater Muslim community. In the recent years, the relationship between law enforcement and Muslims has been largely transactional. We have to get beyond the point, and we have to make sure that law making the necessary investment to nurture the relationship with the Muslim community and rebuild broken bonds. In America, we've seen this relationship crippled, and it goes back to J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO initiative during the late 60s and 70s.
A recent National Counterterrorism Center study has shown that since 1995, 86% of terrorist attacks in the US have been committed by right-wing extremists, and eco-terrorists are opposed, as opposed to the only 12% compared by Muslim terrorists. But despite these reports, a large number of Americans and some other people in the world continue to believe that terrorism is synonymous with Islam. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think you have nearly 2 billion Muslims on the planet Earth, and while we are monolithic, while we're monotheistic, we're not monolithic. And so I think that Islam has been misrepresented. I think that we are looking at, in many ways, a renaissance taking place. This doesn't take away from the tenets of the faith, but I think it puts a greater burden of responsibility on everyday Muslims. Yes, scholars have a strong role, but there are numerous scholars who have appointed themselves as gatekeepers to the faith, who I think have misled many Muslim young men and women into believing that an extremist approach is the right approach. And I think not only is it erroneous to think that way, but I think it's greatly harmful. The Muslim community at large has learned a lot from the African-American Muslim experience in the United States of America.
Teachings of Islam and the Holy Quran, an example of the life of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, very clearly and emphatically reject any targeting of innocent civilians under any circumstances whatsoever. And who would you blame for such a distortion of these peaceful teachings that Islam has?
I don't think to blame anyone. There are misrepresentations of the faith, just like there are misrepresentations in Christianity and other religions. We can remember how the Ku Klux Klan used the Bible to justify the mistreatment of African Americans. And other religious groups have used their holy text as a way to justify actions against humanity. And so I think that people of goodwill have to stand strongly. And I'm encouraging Muslims across the country to be proud to be a Muslim. Muslims are helping to impact our economy by hiring Americans and putting Americans back to work. We're certainly in our educational system. We have great teachers who are helping to graduate students and improve our educational system. We have attorneys and judges. We are trying to grow more in the political sphere, but there are numerous barriers to entry. But I think the more we have a Muslim presence in the political sphere, it will do a great deal at removing some of the misconceptions about what Muslims represent.
And tell us something about those people who actually are preaching hate, like those clerics in various parts of the world. How much responsibility they have to shoulder with regards to the influence on the youth in a negative way?
Well, I don't think we should place the responsibility solely on the clerics, even though they have a commitment to adhere to the Quran. But I think all Muslims who are concerned about how Islam is being misrepresented, we all have a duty to carry the weight of showing the true example of Islam. It doesn't mean that we're perfect human beings. But it does mean that we are fellow human beings who want to do the right thing for living our lives. In fact, the objective isn't to proselytize, but the objective is to live in a way that is authentic, and that authenticity can inspire someone else to make a change and even learn more about the faith.
Do you think the mainstream media do a fair job in covering Islam, or is there a bias inherent in media coverage these days?
Oh, well, certainly there's a bias that exists, but you know, I tell Muslims all the time, don't depend on mainstream media to project Islam in a positive light.
Sure.
We have to take control of our own image. We have to make the investments in outlets or maybe buy a television time to do our own rebranding and re-imaging. We can't allow others to do that, nor should we depend on them to do so, because if we do so, we place an undue burden on them, and we set ourselves up for disappointment and disillusionment.
So we hear that Congressman Carson here is giving a very clear answer that this is in fact not an issue of Islam being a violent faith, and it's not in fact even an issue of Muslims as a community being a terrorist community by any sense. Statistics show otherwise. So what is the cause here, Brother Khalil? If in your opinion, what is it that's actually fueling these apparent acts of terrorism coming from some elements of the Muslim community?
I mean, I think it's important, the point that you make about saying that it's some elements of the Muslim community, because there are 1 billion Muslims in this world, and we'll probably come onto this later on in the programme, but 1 billion Muslims don't engage in acts of terrorism or in acts of violence. In fact, the vast majority of them don't. They're peaceful, including us, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And it's not just something that Congressman Carson recognises. The United States Department for International Development, I think, did a report not too long ago on extremism, and they distinguished between Islamists, IST, and Islamic. And the distinguishing factor between those two phrases was that Islamists utilised Muslim terminology and precepts and texts in order to put forward political aims. But actually, the United States Department for International Development themselves recognised that these had no connection with Islam at all. And in fact, these clerics and others were manipulating Islamic materials for their own political ends.
So it's a clear case almost, Farooq, of a hijacking of a faith by certain extremists. I think this chimes with some of your research you've been doing as well. Is that right?
Let's have a look at a blog by Dean Abdullah, who writes very often for CNN blogs, and also is a very well-known comedian as well. But of course, this article is anything but comedy.
Yeah.
It says, "I'm a Muslim and I hate terrorism." That's the heading. And in a very clear way, he's an American journalist. He says, "We hate these terrorists more than non-Muslims do." How can I say that, he says? Because they harm innocent people in the name of our religion, and consequently we suffer a backlash because of their acts. It can be anything from a spike in hate crimes to people viewing Muslims as less than fully American because of the faith. We are the ones called to answer for the sins of people we detest. Brother Fareed, what do you think about this? How much responsibility there is for those people, towards those people who are calling themselves as religious clerics, and they lead the nations in various countries in the Muslim part of the world? How much responsibility do you have to shoulder about this?
I think the point made by Brother Khalil just a moment ago is quite important, that it is a tiny minority. So these clerics may have a prominent voice in some countries, but they certainly do not reflect the majority of the Muslims in those countries. That said, I think what's interesting is that now we are in a global village. A voice that's raised in one country has a much wider impact and therefore reaches out to those disturbed members of society who are looking for something to latch onto. So the impact of that same cleric is much more wider, it's more global. And that is a cause for concern not just for America, it's a cause for concern globally. So certainly they do shoulder the responsibility for the words and the call to action that they make. The question is, how do you train people to respond to that? How do you prepare people to respond to that and to distinguish their words from the religion in whose name they claim to speak?
But I think this takes actually really nicely onto section number 2, which is to look at the impact. And I think on this point in particular, again, you've done some great research which the viewers can benefit a lot from, I think.
Yes, of course. On the one end, we see a lot of Muslims, not a lot, there's this one section of society in Muslims who do the wrong things. But on the other side of the coin, sometimes the response is also not right by the people not Muslims. This lady here, she's an American doctor, and she wears hijab. And Huffington Post has given a story where it says, Hiba Abdullaban, Muslim woman, says she was attacked over Boston bombings. So only because she wore hijab and she's a Muslim, she was attacked by small minority people. So that's a problem on both sides, isn't it? Not only the Muslim extremists who are causing disrepute to Islam, but also people who are, in general, the American population and the Western people are very, very peace-loving and very tolerant societies. But in reality, there's this little group of people actually has caused so much of havoc, and the media normally picks such stories more than the other ones. Also, a story on Washington Post. I think the heading itself is enough for us to have a look at. It says, "Please don't be a Muslim. Boston Marathon blasts draw condemnation and dread in Muslim world." Shows the anxiety that Muslims sometimes face after such attacks.
Yes. I mean, Brother Khalil, we've been thinking a lot about some of the tragedy that's happened here, but I think it's easy to almost to overlook it, and I think it's hard to underestimate just how much this has shaken American society and also the wider world. I mean, give us an insight from some of your research. How has this impacted on individual lives, but also on wider communities across America and the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say actually that we do very much condemn these acts of violence. I think in that week I had a client in Texas, and I remember sending him an email to express my condolences about Boston, and in the same week in Texas there was a huge fire. So Americans have had pretty tough over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I think it's difficult for Americans because whilst the Boston bombings were an incident of 2 individuals that decided to detonate a bomb at the marathon, they've had lots of other issues as well. Young, disaffected men who are engaging in violence or using guns. I mean, Virginia Tech was one. We've had Boston. We've got the Oklahoma City bombings, Columbine. So, America has really been seeing these over quite a long period of time. And there is some question as to why it is that young people within America are so disenfranchised that having spent such a long period of time in America, they still decide to kill the very people that they grow up with. So there is a real question really about how society deals with people like that.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is quite a key point, and I think actually, Farooq, this resonates with some of the opinions we've got from around the world, because we've been talking with members of the public in Ghana and Australia. So let's take a look at them now and some of our Vox Pops. Let's go to them now.
Islam is a religion that deals with love, talks about love for each other. I think I don't have any negative motive or view about Islam. I think they are one of the best religions that we have on the planet.
I have not seen any religious leader who has come openly to condemn these attacks. And sometimes we say silence means you have shown consent to that. And so for me, there's much for them to do. In this spate of bombings, they should come out clearly and say, no, we don't want it, we don't support it, but they do it in the name of Islam. And once you don't condemn it, then it means you have accepted it.
People do not understand much of religious in terms of worship, you understand? If you understand what the judgment is, I think in terms of Islam committing these things, it is not the best thing. It's not the best.
Islam is a peaceful religion, except that there are people within that religion, unfortunately, who are trying to manipulate or use others to serve their selfish interests and purposes.
My view on Islam is exactly the same as Buddhism, Christianity and the like. We are all human beings at the end of the day, and we all should live in harmony together. And I don't believe that any one religion should be pointed out as being incorrect in their own belief.
First, I was saddened by what had happened. You know, killing innocent people for no reason is not justified in any religion.
Farooq, what I think is nice about this is that it shows, in fact, that the wider world has come out of this without a judgmental process of saying this is Islam that has committed this act of terror. They've somehow been able to disassociate the religion of Islam with the really tragic murder of civilians, which has happened by two disaffected young men. So I think, at least on that side, it's good news.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The question now is, what is the role of the media in this? How much media can do and how much it's doing already? There is one of the stories here, which I think is slightly sad, to be honest. It says, New York Post publishes front page photo falsely linking high school track athlete to Boston bombing. It says further, the New York Post published a front page photo of a high school track athlete named Salah Burhan, 17, sprayed with the headline "Bag Men," linking two almost assuredly innocent people to the Boston Marathon bombing. Seeing his face all over social media, Burhan immediately went to the police. Another one gives a completely different dimension altogether. On Michigan Chronicle, that says, does race of Boston suspects matter? Race being racial background. And this is something, again, is quite worrying. There's CNN's John King leaked information from high-ranking federal official, high-ranking in inverted commas, federal official, that law enforcement was pursuing a dark-skinned male suspect. Now, as things unfolded, these two guys were anything but dark-skinned. They were Russians, as a matter of fact. So the question is, then, are the media stereotyping certain faces and linking to terrorism? And that is a very worrying situation. And lastly, for the time being, we have a story on Guardian newspaper in the UK, and it says Boston witch hunt on social media sites and a bad week for the old guard. Now, that's something to do with social media. We know it's very popular these days amongst youth. One crucial question is whether the whip-like response of social media and its unlimited appetite for content after an event such as Boston causes the established media to struggle to stay relevant by publishing half-baked snippets and worsening the industry's natural reflex to want to be first with the news. Can we speak to Brother Qasim perhaps at this point and ask him this question with regards to this issue? Assalamu alaikum, Brother Qasim, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm well. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, very well indeed. Of course, in a great company of Hazur at the moment. Of course, won't keep you for too long on this show. The question now is that, do you agree with this, that social media has put a lot of pressure on the mainstream media to actually come up with the stories soon enough? And sometimes it could even be half-baked snippets, if you like.
Yeah, I think it's easy to blame social media, but I don't know why social media should ever allow any news organization to compromise their journalistic integrity. If I'm running a news organization, my top priority is to maintain my trust, my viewership, to let them know that I'm trustworthy, that I'm reliable, that I'm honest, that I have integrity. And if I'm allowing myself to be pushed around by this threat of social media, then I'm telling the world that I'm really not that reliable or trustworthy in the first place. And I think what we saw with the Boston Marathon tragedy, this horrible act of terror, is several so-called news outlets basically forsook their journalistic integrity and tried to be more sensational than honest. And that had a bigger backlash than they could possibly have imagined. I know several people now, even in my own network, that simply do not watch many of these news stations that you just mentioned. I know I personally now have turned to social media almost entirely, that if it's news, it will spike in my social media. Otherwise, I don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yes. So, well, brother, then, if you were to give us a sense of within the US, then, what sort of impact this has had? Because obviously we've heard from the angle of, to some extent, concern about Islamophobia, but I think let's be very balanced here as well and say that, in fact, the real or the great sadness here is the loss of life which has happened. So how has the media reported this loss of life, and gives a sense of how Americans on US soil are responding to this tragedy? How has it impacted their lives?
Well, to be clear, it is an absolute devastation that people lost their lives in this horrible act of terror. Anytime people lose their lives, innocent people, it is an atrocity. What's interesting about these events is that they give Americans an opportunity to join together stronger, more solid against extremism, against terrorism. And I think that's one thing that we saw happen today after this Boston terrorist attack. Yes, there was Islamophobia that was spreading, there was misinformation. I personally received threats of violence because I'm Muslim. Female friends of mine who don't wear the hijab were harassed in public. But I think that's secondary to the fact that this is another opportunity for us to stand united against extremism. And this is exactly the message that His Holiness, the Khalifa of Islam, gave yesterday to over 350 politicians when he condemned the Boston bombing. His exact message was that this is not an opportunity to defame Islam that will get us nowhere. This is more importantly an opportunity for us to stand united against extremism. And I think that's what Americans are doing after this attack, and I'm proud to say that our nation is coming together for that reason.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you shortly. Farooq, I think some of our viewers and even us in the studio, we need to address this question and say, what is Islam's approach on terrorism? And some people may be saying, does Islam support terrorism in any way? So I think, you've been looking through the blogs. What have you found?
Patheus.com has given a blog which is, again, very informative and very insightful. It says why religion and terrorism are opposites. To be religious, to be close to God, is to understand His love and mercy and the protection of innocent lives. But what is more interesting is, in fact, a comment by one of the non-Muslims with his username Jesus Without Baggage. And what he says is he's an American, apparently, who says, thanks for your blog post. This is a message that needs to be heard, as there are a lot of haters who hate Islam with great passion. I see some of them have commented here. Are there problems with violence in Islam? You bet. Just as there is a history of violence in Christianity, he says. I choose to stand with the majority of American Muslims who oppose terrorism. I think he is actually representing many millions of Americans who are peace-loving, tolerant people, and also other people in all societies. But in fact, the problem is we hear more of those silent those vocal minorities more than these silent majorities.
Yes.
Something which I think is very interesting is data taken from FBI's official website. Is about the terrorism between 1980 and 2005 on American soil. Now that is an eye-opener. If you look at that in the 25 years period, look at this pie chart. On the right side, Latinos have done 42% of attacks, those people who are terrorist Latinos, maybe from that background. And also 24% have been extremist from left-wing groups. What's interesting is only 6% were Muslims. And what is even more interesting is 7% were Jewish extremists. So that clearly means extremism has no religion and no background. It's just extremism. And one more thing to back it up is the data from Europe as well. Again, that was published on EU Terrorism Situation and Trend Report, so-called TSAT. It says that 0.7% of terrorist attacks have been done by Muslims, committed by Muslims. And this table here, again, gives the details of this. Interestingly, there was only one attack in 2009 on Italian soil by Muslims, whereas a vast majority was from separatist or left-wing groups. So again, a religion cannot be responsible of some people's stupid acts.
Well, Freed, Mr. Ahmed, I think this is, in and of itself, these statistics are enough to show that, in fact, this is not, Islam is not to blame and the wider Muslim community are not to blame. And I think that almost ends that debate, which is very positive for us. But at the same time, there is this perception that it is the blame of Islam and that it is the fault of Muslims. So taking that into account, are Muslims doing enough to essentially turn this negative image, this negative perception? Are they doing enough to really react against it and show the innocence of Islam, do you feel?
I think there's two parts to that question. One is, what is the Muslim community doing in response to this? And I think the answer is quite a lot. If you look at, for example, the way the Ahmadiyya community has responded to issues, not just in Boston, but also to 9/11 and before, they've run huge campaigns to educate, because this is as much an opportunity to educate people about the true message of Islam. The question then becomes, is how is that campaign, how is that work projected to the wider audience? And I think this brings us to an earlier point as well, is the role of the media. It chooses to focus on the negative activities rather than on the positive, which in turn hampers the efforts of good-natured people, Muslims and other people who also support the work that's being done, to get that message across to the wider world that Islam, Christianity, Judaism, these are faiths that do not promote violence. No faith promotes violence. So I believe Muslims are doing enough. I believe more can be done. But at the same time, there's a partnership that needs to take place between the people and the media and how that's projected. Otherwise, such distortions will continue to happen.
I've got it. Okay, so two key points. Essentially, Muslims are speaking out, but are we as a wider community ready to hear those voices? Khalil, I mean, within the Muslim community, there are some elements. The two brothers that have committed this atrocity are two examples of radicalization taking place. How can the Muslim community prevent this radicalization process from happening, would you say?
I mean, the starting point has got to be to understand Islam, hasn't it? You know, and so if anybody associates with Islam and on the basis of Islam decides to commit some act of terrorism, in the words of, I think, Congressman Carson, when he mentioned law enforcement, that was a really telling phrase, because what these people are criminals. They're not necessarily representatives of any religion, and they should be dealt with according to the full force of the law. But I just want to touch on precisely what Islam actually says about terrorism, that in order to make somebody feel persecuted or to live in fear of their lives is worse than killing them. And of course, La ikraha fi din, which is no compulsion in religion, also makes clear that really terrorism has no place in Islam. So that, before you even get to the principle of doing anything that is terrorist, if you look at the Holy Quran, you can find that the Holy Quran doesn't permit that. In addition to that, then the Holy Quran and the Prophet ﷺ and the Holy Prophet ﷺ make absolutely clear, well, what is it that we should do as individuals in order to not get involved in terrorism? Well, you start by having proper moral upbringing. You start by ensuring that any Muslim doesn't engage in any activity that disrupts the peace of others. And where others do engage in activities that disrupt the peace of others, the way that you respond is peacefully. That is precisely why we have a motto of love for all, hatred for none. So if people aren't listening to what we have to say, well, we engage in a positive and reasoned debate, and if they decide that they don't want to follow the right path, well, that's their choice, and not for us to engage in any form of hatred.
It's a very powerful message, I think, Farooq, which is really essentially, if you know Islam, then you don't commit terror. Islam is no compulsion within religion, and in fact it states very clearly that the loss of one person's life is almost to take the life of all of humanity. So it's impossible to truly know Islam and commit terror. So I think this helps us to understand the impact section. So how about we move forward to part 3, which is to look at solutions in particular. And again, I think that we've benefited a great deal from talking to Congressman Carson. So let's go and have a listen to him, and let's see what he says about how we can move forward to prevent acts of terror like this in the future.
Do you think such campaigns have an impact?
Oh, certainly. And that goes back to my original point. I think the more we have efforts like the one coming from the Ahmadiyya movement and other groups of goodwill, I think we'll slowly see a change in the environment. And we'll see the kind of Islamophobia and xenophobic behavior wane a bit. We'll probably never be able to eliminate it, but at least we can contain it in a way where we can open dialogue for other interfaith groups to talk about how we can come up with solutions that will make our communities better, our society better, our country and our world better.
Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, is touring the west coast of the US. Last year, I know you attended the reception at Capitol Hill, where during his address, His Holiness unequivocally stated that Islam was a peaceful religion. He cited specific teachings of the Holy Quran and examples from the life of the Holy Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How was that speech received by the audience there?
Oh, very well, extremely well. Many of my colleagues in Congress who are Christian and Jewish and other faiths, they were really moved by his words. And I think because the Ahmadiyya movement has done a good job of interfaith outreach and building networks of support throughout various communities, I think we're seeing the fruits of their labor manifest, and it was manifested in that speech.
Do you think the lack of justice, it could be a contributing factor to radicalism and extremism?
Oh, I mean, the same injustices that causes gang activities in the inner cities in America for young men to lash out and act out in ways that are harmful to society. I think these same issues, particularly the government's unwillingness to address the poverty issue, global poverty. I think global poverty and the lack of sufficient education all are components that help to fuel the fires of extremism.
Lastly, what can be done, do you think, to address this lack of justice, domestically and internationally?
Well, I think people of goodwill have to speak out. I think people of goodwill have to be engaged in the political process. I think there has to be a kind of agitation outside of the system and inside of the system where public officials are held accountable. It's not enough for public officials to come to communities and try to court the Muslim vote, as it were. And once Muslims vote them in office and Muslims support them financially and politically, there aren't any accountability measures in place. And as a result, elected officials get very comfortable. They're unafraid to speak out against anti-Sharia legislation. They tend to be cowardly as it relates to really engaging the Muslim community, except for when it's time to get reelected. And so I think people of goodwill have to stand strongly and come together and be very vocal and really be willing to lobby elected officials about some of these issues. You know, most elected officials are generalists. They're not scholars. They don't know many issues in depth. And so people who are concerned about injustice have to be willing to sit down and kind of court these legislators and educate them on the issues. And if the education doesn't take place, or if our leaders renege on their commitments, then we have to be willing to form movements to vote them out of office.
Right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I mean, at the end, I have to say one thing. We are really, truly proud of people like yourself, who are Muslims and who are loyal citizens of the country that you reside in. We thank you very much, Congressman Andre Carson. All the best to you.
Thank you. Keep up the great work.
Okay, let's go over to the US. Let's speak to Brother Qasim. Are you with us there, brother?
Yes.
Let me ask you this question then. So we know then quite clearly that Islam fundamentally rejects terror, and that in fact the Muslim Ummah or the Muslim nation in the modern age rejects terror. But even more than this, how is it that Islam can be used as a method to prevent terror and combat terror? And how are we seeing this play out, for example, within the US at the moment with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community?
Well, I think it goes back to the fundamental teaching of Islam that every Muslim has two duties, two responsibilities to fulfill their life purpose. One is their duty to God, and that is worshiping God and paying homage to Him. And second is your duty to mankind, and that is your service to mankind. Islam is very clear that you cannot fulfill your duty to God unless and until you fulfill your duty to mankind. And here in America, one of the many means that we're doing that service to mankind includes the Muslims for Life blood drive, which, for example, has raised over 25,000 blood donations in honor of 9/11 victims, and that's just in the last 2 years. In addition to that, our Muslim youth organization, Khudam al-Ahmadiyya, has adopted over 50 highways. We run dozens of soup kitchens, clothing drives, food drives, things of that nature. We get involved in the local school. So I think the message that we need to get across is that Islam is about service to humanity. And the more consistently and the more emphatically we can demonstrate that, the more easy it will be to show that Islam is in fact a religion of peace, one that not only promotes peace through word, but also indeed by serving our fellow man.
Perfect. Qasim, we're going to come back to you. Please hold the line. But before we do, Brother Farooq, again, some excellent research which we've been taking a look at. Can we have a sense of what solutions we can have to take forwards?
We have a very good research team, actually. That's the secret.
That's our blessing, isn't it?
Right. There's a message here on our Twitter account from Anila Mirza. She says, lack of education about their own religion. She's referring to those people who actually are perpetrating hate. So that's the lack of religion. That's the reason, lack the knowledge of religion. Then one of the stories here, which certainly is not a very good reading, to be honest, because that's from somebody you would expect to be more sensible than what he said. He is Peter T. King, who is one of the congressmen in America. He says, after Boston, we should put Muslims under surveillance, says the Representative King. Now, we can also make our minds up. Do you think he's right? Let's ask the question to people here in the studio. What do you think, Khalil Saab? Do you think it's fair enough to say that?
No. I mean, there's an obvious problem, isn't there? If somebody is a Christian and they become a Muslim, do you suddenly put them under surveillance? And if somebody is a Muslim, becomes a Christian, do you suddenly take the bug out of their telephone? I mean, clearly it is not a reasonable proposal, and I think it's one of those proposals that is simply designed to ignite the debate about Muslims and their connection with terrorism. And I think communities like the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, you know, not just here in Britain, but in America, in Germany, in Canada, in all of the 202 countries, as Qasim has quite rightly said, is really engaged in a struggle. I mean, that's really what a jihad is a physical struggle in order to make sure that the proper and true message of Islam is put forward. So Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, the fifth Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, is currently on a tour in the United States. He's made speeches in the British Parliament, in the EU, on Capitol Hill. I was just looking at, in preparation for this programme, the last 5 speeches that he had done as part of his Friday sermons, and those were on truth and justice, on the responsibilities of a Muslim, and on fulfilling your covenants. And so, you know, in every single one of Hazur's speeches, you are getting guidance within our community on how to not just behave as a Muslim, but how that should manifest itself in its day-to-day life. And the proof is really in the pudding, because in our community you will find no instances of terrorism. You will find nobody that's engaged in any kind of illegality of the scale that we're talking about here. I mean, well, any scale, really.
Well, this is key, and this actually I wanted to ask both of you this question. So I know quite clearly then you're saying there is a sort of an exemplar model, which is the Khalifa of Islam. But on a sort of a governmental level, a political level, Fareed, what should we be asking our leaders to be doing? And we've heard obviously the politician Mr. King in the US giving some unorthodox approaches. But what are the correct, balanced, just approaches which world leaders should adopt to prevent the atrocities which are taking place in some parts of the world today?
It's a big challenge. I think that's the first thing we should be clear of, that if you're looking at what governments can do, what action they can take, it is quite a big challenge. I think the reaction should be, one government minister once said here that we should be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, and I think that plays out here as well. We have to be honest about what we're dealing with and address that in a manner that is suitable to the crime that's being committed. Also, I think there's a role for education, and education in the widest sense, that not just about, you know, does Islam relate to terrorism or relate to peace, but it's got to be across all faiths. We have to send that message clearly that religion is a force for good in society, and through that recognize and promote that message more widely. I think the risk is that if you only focus on the negative activities, you reinforce the stereotypes that exist. So governments need to look at the causes that we've talked about, online extremism. How can that be tackled? Part of that responsibility lies with enabling communities to do more. Part of that responsibility lies with government, enabling them to do more to curtail such activities. It's a huge task, but I think one also that will not happen overnight. It will take many, many years for them to tackle this issue.
Yes, and I know as well in particular that some of our research again is taking a focus on, we're asking ourselves in terms of on an individual level, but globally people are saying, well, we see Muslims committing these acts of terror, so-called Muslims. How often do we see Muslims doing acts of love, acts of peace, acts to calm terror? And I think you found a great story on this as well, actually, a recent blog talking about some Ahmadi Muslims, is that right?
Yes, there's a couple of things there. First of all, from my brother Qasim, who's also on the show at the moment through Skype in Los Angeles. He has written a blog on Huffington Post, which the title is, Do you even hear Muslims when we condemn violence? What he's saying is that I received messages that the condemnation wasn't loud enough or clear enough or passionate enough. In other words, all they heard from me was blah, 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 blah. That's what he says. But I think something more very serious is, in fact, the activities, all the work that Jamaat is doing, the Ahmadi Muslim community is doing for the service of mankind. And that's very obvious. It's not even a month ever since the Boston bombings happened. Now the Khalifa of Islam goes to America, and look at the reception he received there in America, only because of the voice that he's raising about peace. Now, that's on LA Times, Global Voices, Ahmadi's mission of peace in an age of terror. Now, he has been interviewed by LA Times, and I just quote one thing Hazul said, which I think is a response which gives the clear solution to the problems the world is facing at the moment. Hazul says that, let me just sort of make it slightly smaller so people can view it at ease. There's now no such religious war. Whenever any jihadist organization stands up in the name of Islam and misconstrues its true teachings, we have to stand up to this and speak out. Not only in the US, but everywhere in the world, you see the name of Islam being defamed by opponents. Those who don't have a true understanding of Islam. These are militant groups, not followers of the true religion, and we always stand against them. So these are the words of the fifth successor of the Prophet Messiah, the worldwide head of the Ahmadi Muslim community.
Well,
that is the solution.
I think we're fairly blessed again, and the blessings are never ending here, because I think let's go now to the US. Let's ask Qasim about this. Brother Qasim, Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, welcome.
So, firstly, let's talk a little bit about this article. I mean, what is it that prompting you to say that peaceful and loving Muslims are speaking loudly, but people aren't hearing us, to the point that you feel it's as if they simply think, or some sectors of society think that Muslims are saying blah, blah, blah. Give us a background to this.
Well, I think there's two things to consider. One thing to consider, here in America, the Ahmadi community is leading the charge in condemning terrorism and serving humanity, but I also want to recognize that there are several other Muslim organizations in America that are taking that lead and working together with us and independently of us to show that Islam is a religion of service to humanity. But what prompted me to write this article really stems back to what we saw happen in Pakistan 40 years ago with the demonization of Ahmadi Muslims. What began as mere demonization has now turned into a full-scale, constant act of terrorism against not only Ahmadis, but against Christians, Hindus, Jews, and of any faith minority. And so the warning that I'm giving here is that in America, if we do not stop this anti-Islam behavior, this ignorance and this bigotry, then we risk ruining our own nation. And we have an example in Pakistan. So I'm pleading with the general public that enough of this ignorance. We're not under threat from radical Islam. We are under threat from radical ignorance, and we need to rise above as a nation and write the narrative of peace and service to humanity if we want to move forward as a nation.
Brother Qasim, just hold there one moment. I'm going to come right back to you. Fareed, we're here in the UK, and obviously your work is within government. You're blessed to be able to work within the state. We've heard some of the negatives, but people at home might be thinking, well, you guys don't live in Pakistan. We do live in Pakistan. We know the torture of what prejudice, discrimination and brutality really looks like. So just to also give the other side of the coin, what are the positives about the Western values of equality, dignity, respect, and how does that enable Muslims to practice their faith in a holistic manner? Is there a different side to this?
I think absolutely the West is often portrayed in a particular way across the Muslim world, but at the same time, in many ways, the West upholds some of the Islamic values far more than you would find in the Muslim world. The freedom of religion, the value of freedom of religion we find in the UK, in America and other countries is not existent in some countries in the Muslim world. the way the country treats different races, the race equality laws, the laws that allow freedom to practice your faith, freedom to preach your faith, freedom to live in peace, the protections that offer, the law and order that exists in these countries. These are values that are fundamental to Islam, but are modelled by these countries far better. So I think that you're absolutely right that the West, in many ways, needs to be seen better in a more balanced way, in the way it presents these values and allows people of different faiths, of different backgrounds, of different abilities to live and live peacefully.
It's a key message, so really valuable there, Farooq, that essentially, if we're looking for true Islam, where can we find it around the world? And let's not simply look at labels, let's not simply look at form, but let's look at substance. And true values, true Islamic values, are those of compassion, those of dignity, those of respect, equality. And according to Fareed, you find this in the West almost more than anything else, anywhere else. That's lovely.
Got a very quick tweet here from Sarah Niz from America, and she's talking about that Peter King, which we discussed previously, who said that Muslims should be under surveillance. She's saying that Peter King came to a mosque and said he is not against Muslims, but that all terrorists seem to be coming from there. And she says he was impressed by our community and encouraged us to come forward in the society and show this side of Islam, which we are already.
That's positive. I think at least we have some hope. I think this is what it's all about. Through dialogue, you can come to a better understanding. Let me just go back to Qasim as well. Brother Qasim. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. So we've heard a little bit about already that the Khalifa of Islam has left UK soil and he's come to the US. We've seen some scenes of a motorcade from the airport, and we've also seen dignitaries greeting the Khalifa. I think this is a very valuable image to see, which is the very, very counter image of the tragic and very ignorant acts of two disaffected young boys who, bless them, they really didn't have any sense of any humanity or Islam. But you've got the authorities within California and the Khalifa of Islam greeting each other like one family almost. Can you give us a sense of what this trip has been like so far?
This trip has been an incredible blessing for Ahmadi Muslims in America, but I think more importantly than that even, it's been an incredible blessing for America and for Americans, because now they see an example of a Muslim leader who has unequivocally condemned terrorism, who relentlessly pursues service of humanity and promotion of peace, and who doesn't just talk the talk, but also walks the walk. I cannot wait until His Holiness the Khalifa of Islam's lecture is aired on MTA, because I want the world to really see this message. And every politician, every faith leader, every government leader or university professor that was present, they were all in unison, regardless of their background, that this is a man who speaks from the heart. This is a man who speaks with conviction, with confidence. You know, one of the questions asked of the Khalifa of Islam was that, aren't you afraid that because of your moderate stance, because of your tolerant stance, people might come after you and kill you? And the Khalifa of Islam smiled and gave such a beautiful answer. He said that it is Allah's responsibility to take care of me. It is my responsibility to convey the message of peace and service to humanity to the world. And that is what I will continue to do. And the proof of that, as you mentioned already, is that despite the vast persecution that Ahmadi Muslims have faced over the past 125 years, we have never once had an act of violence. And that comes down to the identity, the true Islamic identity that the Khalifa of Islam has embodied in every Ahmadi Muslim. So the atmosphere here in America is one of joy, is one of confidence, and is one of hope of what the future holds for Islam in America.
Excellent. Very useful for us to get an overview and a snapshot of that. Brother Farooq, I think again your research is key in terms of the connections we can draw.
Very profound response from Hazur, and I think I'm still in that awe and shock as to how people can ask such questions and how beautifully the answer comes up from Khalifa of Islam. One of the texts here sent to us from one of the Ahmadis, who is from the UK, is just a very short excerpt from the Prophet Messiah about wars, putting an end to war. He says, I know for certain, the Prophet Messiah of Islam says, I know for certain that the burden of the sins of those people who commit murders through ignorance on account of such preaching and who are unaware of the reason why Islam had to fight battles in the early stages lies on the necks of these Maulvis, the clerics, who go on propagating secretly these dangerous doctrines which result in such grievous loss of life.
I think, Khalil, this is something we were mentioning earlier. I mean, within Islam, you look to the Quran, and then you look to the practice of the founder of Islam, or essentially the master prophet within Islam, which is the Holy Prophet of Islam, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him. What can we get a sense of from within his life of how he responded to terrorism? And God forbid, people may even suggest that we've heard people say before that he was a terrorist, God forbid. So what's the reality there, which you could really offer a very powerful balm to the chaos and the tragedy which we've seen?
I mean, I would encourage people actually to read a book written by the Promised Messiah ﷺ called British Government and Jihad. This is an excellent book because what it does is it really sets out what the concept of jihad is, and it talks about, well, it disowns terrorism. It makes very clear in that book that actually Islam was never spread by the sword, and that it wasn't a violent religion. It isn't a violent religion. And that actually Islam is beautiful enough to be able to provide enlightenment through teaching, through enlightenment, through reasoning, through argument, and above all, through God's blessing. So I mean, I think that is a very good book that I would encourage people to read. I would also encourage them to look at the Holy Quran, chapter 22, verse 40, which also sets out that really war is only about is defensive in nature. You're only entitled really to engage in war when war is made against you, and then when you've been wronged, and then with Allah's blessing you have permission to fight back. So there are lots of examples within the Promised Messiah's life in terms of the material that he's written. If you look at Malfuzat, I think volume 3 is very good. There's a lot of material in that that sets out how Islam addresses these sorts of issues.
Excellent.
One other point that I would make, I mean, from a secular perspective, actually, there have been some very interesting articles that have been written about Islam and extremism, and one that I would also recommend is one written by Professor Robert Pape, who is a lecturer in the University of Chicago, and he wrote a very interesting piece about terrorism generally. And he did some research on 315 terrorists and identified that actually Islam had nothing to do with terrorism, but it was very much to do with political goals. So I think that's in the American Journal of Political Science, so another good bit of material to look at.
Perfect, okay. So we have some, and I think the Quranic verse is particularly key. So we have about a minute and a half. I want to ask each of the guests before we finish, what does the road ahead look like? The next 10 years, how are we going to see the fight against terror pan out? And are we going to see the victory of peace over war and tragedy and terror? Qasim, let me start with you, brother.
I will say very quickly that over the next 10 years, you will see dramatic improvements on the way Islam is viewed in the world, because under the guidance of His Holiness the Khalifa of Islam, you are going to see incredible advancements in service to humanity and in scholarship that demonstrates without a doubt continually that Islam is in fact a peaceful faith designed for the uplift and service of humanity and the worship of one God.
Excellent, thank you very much. Brother Fareed, your take on this?
I think in the next 10 years, as the good works of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community become more prominent, I think there will also be, unfortunately, a rise in activities against such work as well. I think the two, unfortunately, go hand in hand. If we look at the history of religion, when prophets appear, their good work is also there. The work of their opponents is also there. And ultimately, the prophets will win. It's up to God to decide when that moment occurs. But I think that journey, that path, will see both elements come to the fore.
Okay, so the tragedy, we have some tough times ahead potentially. Khalil, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, obviously as a community, we talk about how Islam is supposed to be propagated, but we practice it as well. We have, I think, 4,000 life devotees that have been trained in professional roles. I think that just one statistic I was looking at, we had about 579 books in the last year that have been translated in 60 countries, 45 languages, 9.2 million leaflets and pamphlets. Excellent. And books that have been distributed. So, as a community, we are actually taking practical steps in order to make sure that the proper message of Islam is put out there. And I think that the future is very bright for Islam, particularly under the leadership of Hazrat Khalifatul Masih.
Okay, we have it there, Farooq. So what we've learned from today, the three key issues we've looked at the causes of the Boston bombings and these acts of terror. We've looked at the impact, which has been profound tragedy. And we've looked at the solutions. And in fact, the solutions really lie with education and the removal of ignorance, both within the Muslim community and outside the Muslim community, founded upon common values, I guess, of compassion, of dignity, of equality. And that's all we can really hope for as human beings, isn't it? So another wonderful show. So I think that's all we can do now is thank our guests once again. Thank you so much for joining us. May God bless both of you. And Brother Qasim, thank you very much for joining us. And viewers at home as well, thank you very much for being with us, sending your tweets in, sending your emails in. We do want more tweets though, don't we, Brother Farooq? So to our viewers at home, we want more of your tweets. We'd like more interaction even, so we can get your views on air as well, I think.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, please join us for episode 8. And until then, please remember us in your prayers, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon you.
He has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists. Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.